It's probably a weird, hard-to-fathom idea for many young moviegoers today. A multi-episode, TV show-esque set of narrative chapters, showed over consecutive weeks, playing before the feature at your local cinema. And yet, as strange as the idea might sound now, movie serials were a significant and wildly successful part of the movie-going experience throughout the first half of the 20th century. The form can be traced back to the days of silent film, as both the burgeoning Hollywood studio system and international film productions offered up popular serials such as The Perils of Pauline, The Exploits of Elaine, and The Hazards of Helen, which not only helped kickstart the serial trend, but also established numerous adventurous heroine and damsel in distress tropes, such as a woman being tied to railroad tracks by a dastardly villain. Serials continued into the sound era, with each major Hollywood studio assembling their own regular team of stars and film crews to crank out weekly installments of tales set in the action-adventure, crime-thriller, western, horror, and sci-fi genres. Each new installment ending on an intriguing cliffhanger, so as to ensure the mostly young audience they were aiming for would feel compelled to return next week to see how their heroes would get out of this one. The serials of the 30s, 40s, and 50s often focused on well-known characters already established in literature and comic strips. Superman, Batman, the Lone Ranger, Tarzan, Captain Marvel, Dick Tracy, The Shadow, The Phantom, and the Green Hornet all starred in successful serials of the time. Meanwhile, young sci-fi fans of the time had no shortage of outer space adventure serials to be thrilled by, but two rival space hero characters in particular stood out among the rest: Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Both, interestingly enough, were portrayed in their respective serials by the same handsome Olympic swimmer turned actor, Buster Crabbe, who also played Tarzan in the serials, making him one of the undisputed kings of the genre. Among the millions of young audience members watching Buster Crabbe inhabit his various characters every week was a young boy named George Lucas. While growing up on his family's walnut farm in California, Lucas absolutely adored the sci-fi serials he took in at his local theater, and would not forget the excitement they brought him as he himself grew up and eventually started to study film at USC. As a young adult, Lucas felt a sense of that same fun he experienced watching serials as a child was missing from the more dark, dystopian bent the genre had taken in the 70s, thanks to films like Rollerball, Logan's Run, A Clockwork Orange, and even his own THX 1138. Lucas, who had become interested in science as a child thanks to the serials he watched, wanted to encourage a similar interest in space exploration by crafting his own fun adventure stories for a younger audience. And not surprisingly, thought the best potential way to do so might be to simply remake one of his favorite serials from his childhood. But when he couldn't get the rights to the character in question, he was forced instead to create his own homage to the sci-fi serials of his youth. He called it Star Wars, and in the wake of its massive success, the floodgates were indeed opened to a new wave of kid-orientated sci-fi adventure. Ironically enough, a new adaptation of the very character Lucas had failed to attain the rights to was one of the very first projects quickly assembled to try to cash in on Star Wars, creating a special sort of cinematic irony. Would that project that had almost been Star Wars be able to compete with Star Wars? Well, no. But that doesn't change the fact that the character himself still holds a very important place in science fiction history. The year is 1980, and infamous producer Dino De Laurentis is ready to launch the next big sci-fi franchise by returning to one of the genre's earliest heroes, with Flash Gordon. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Welcome once again to Failure to Franchise, the show dedicated to some of Hollywood's most infamous mistakes, missteps, and misfires. This is Trev.
Trev, I love you, but we only have 14 hours to save the podcast. So I'm Chris, and he'll save every one of us.
Perfect. Perfect. As our listeners have probably already guessed from that incredible dramatic work from my co-host Chris, this is the beginning of a new series for us. We've wrapped up our summer surprise. We survived. But this is a very exciting series. We've been teasing this one for a while.
Mm-hmm.
We've been kind of saying people just need to stick with us through Summer Surprise. This is going to be the longest series we've done yet, but it's one I am very, very excited for. Chris, why don't you tell everyone about what this series is before we say our specific movie for today?
For sure. This begins fall back to the 80s. In our podcast here, we've actually never jumped into the 1980s filmography. So this will be it's kind of going to be a fun conversation throughout August to October. I am
3 months. 3 months of the 80s.
3 months, and let me rattle the titles off right off the top if you want. So right now, obviously, we're looking at Flash Gordon from 1980. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension from 1984. Then we're going to be looking at Rocky and the Creed series, kind of like a little success to series, actually. Longtime listeners know that we have a spin-off show that we do because we don't want to die of exhaustion while watching a bunch of junk. The next is Streets of Fire, 1984. Then Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins from 1985, Masters of the Universe from 1987, and then Shocker from 1989. So we have a long way to go. Very excited. I'm a child of the 90s. Trev is a child of the 80s. So we thought these episodes are going to be quite fun. Quite fun.
Yeah, and what I really love about it, too, is as Chris was reading those, obviously you're also giving the years, and you can hear that we're running the gamut of the decade.
Yeah.
Doing it chronologically, starting today with a movie from 1980 and ending with a movie from 89. So we're running through the entire decade. And yeah, this is... I guess you can say it's my decade, right? I was born in 80, and I definitely grew up, and I definitely wanted to start here.
1880.
Yeah, 1880, yeah. The first movie I saw was Train Leaves Station. It was great. But no, so I did want to talk a little bit before we get into today's film, which is Flash Gordon, which, I mean, I think, to me, is just a movie that, in so many ways, just symbolizes the 80s. I would imagine you agree now, having seen it. But I want to talk about just the 80s as a decade, and in particular, for the purposes of our show, as a decade in film. Because what I'm sure even you, as someone who's more of a child of the 90s, you're definitely very aware of the 80s because 80s nostalgia has been a huge part of media for the past, I don't know, probably a decade now, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
With things like Stranger Things, Wonder Woman 84, so many 80s properties getting like relaunched and rebooted. So 80s nostalgia, it's still kind of hanging on. Stranger Things obviously just came back with a really critically acclaimed huge season. So it's not going anywhere. I'm even ready to kind of move more into 90s nostalgia.
Right.
But 80s nostalgia not going anywhere. So I want to ask you, Chris, as an outsider, as someone who did not grow up in it, I want to ask you first, and then I will come in with my thoughts on it. What do you think it is about the 80s, in particular 80s cinema, that people are so nostalgic for, even including maybe people who didn't grow up during it? Because obviously a lot of the Stranger Things like fan base are people who they have an 80s nostalgia even though they didn't ever live in the 80s, right? And I find that interesting. So what do you think it is that what's the appeal of 80s movies? I'm going to hear your thoughts.
I think it's because the last 10 to 15 years outside of the 80s nostalgia has been pretty samey. I think a lot of it has to do with that. I think blockbuster or even modern filmmaking and the popular stuff of today is just a lot of the same thing. The same look, the same feel, the same texture, the same scores. Like, it's all Hans Zimmer, you know what I mean? And I think the 80s kind of brings back a sense of maybe innocence, something, I don't know, like, especially even just like the music. Like the music is very different. There's like a synthiness that is happening especially in horror. A lot of horror scores over the last 10 years have been adopting more synth-based scores. Yep. And I think, it's just maybe a simpler time. I also think, this is funny. I think me and you have talked about this, but definitely me and my other buddy have talked about how the world is in absolute chaos. Okay? And it's been in chaos since especially 2001. We've always been saying that 2001, after September 11th, it felt like the world was on this weird downward spiral of complete disorganization. And it's been a long time since... do you know what I'm trying to say? I feel like the 80s was like a time that was hustling and bustling. You know, like there was people had a little bit more money in the 80s. Things were going well in the 80s,
Well,
and it didn't feel as like apocalyptic as the 2000s and above have been. Would you maybe agree with that?
Maybe, but I think I always relate that more to the 90s, actually, because the 90s started to, because the 80s, I guess it depends on your culture, your political leanings, you know.
Sure.
The 80s obviously had the AIDS crisis. The 80s had, the crack epidemic. Reagan was president for 8 years in the 80s, and that was not very exciting. I don't know. I'm sorry, listeners who are more on the right of me, but there's a lot of bad stuff about the 80s too. The 80s really was, there was a lot of darkness that decade, but I think maybe that's why there was so much escapism happening in the movies, and that's what I'm trying to speak to again. So there's just like so much creativity in the 80s. Like there's a lot of, it's very different. The style is wild. Well, the fashion was wild. The hair, you know what I mean? So what I think is a big part of it, and this does speak to what you were getting at, because you mentioned how. So even if I don't entirely agree with you that maybe everything like culturally and politically was like great in the 80s, what is true about the 80s is it was obviously known for a very capitalistic decade, right? Money was being thrown around like crazy. It was the age of the yuppies. And it was an age where a lot of Hollywood kind of shakers and movers, power players were looking to make money quick. We're looking to use movies and use these kind of startup studios to funnel money, like tax havens and things like that. And so suddenly you had a lot of new people getting involved in the movie business. And I do think what's interesting is that I think both of us probably should, given what this podcast is and our general thoughts on how we're getting a little frustrated with modern cinema to a certain degree, we should probably hate the 80s in a certain way, 80s films, because it really is the decade that started this trajectory that Hollywood's been on ever since, of heading towards franchise-first, corporate-led studio fare. Because the 80s was the studio comeback, right? So I'm definitely if you put my feet to the fire and ask me what's the best decade for cinema, I'm going to be that pretentious, typical film nerd that says it's the 70s. The 70s is the best decade because it's when the directors had the most control. They suddenly, because of films like, like stuff like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde and all these things, like suddenly they were like, oh, okay, we're going to let directors kind of have more free reign. And then there was some really high profile disasters from that model in the late 70s. And the studios like took control back in the 80s. And they particularly said, well, let's make sure we're creating these like big, high concept blockbusters that can be franchises. And obviously that's what we see today too. But the difference is, like you just said, in the 80s, it was like that was a new kind of thought. It was a new model. And so there was more creativity, and they were looking to actually come up with more franchises kind of out of nowhere. So you had things like E.T. and Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, which I know is like a tribute to serials, but was like an original property. A movie like Beetlejuice as a studio film, you wouldn't see that today. Well, you would, but you only would because it would be Beetlejuice being relaunched, right? You wouldn't see a new movie like Beetlejuice coming from a studio today. So,
or Ghostbusters.
Yeah, exactly. Like all these like very like as I said, it was the age of high concept. And for people who wonder what high concept means, high concept is basically just a terminology that means it's supposed to be like a concept that can easily, in like one sentence or two, be explained to an audience, so they just get it, right? So Ghostbusters, exterminators who bust ghosts, Back to the Future, kid has to go back in time to make sure his parents get married. Like these like really kind of simple concepts, but very, very creative, very unique. And there's just people just throwing money around and being willing to make all these crazy films. And I think even as we just look at the films we've chosen for these, we're looking at like the failures, right? We're looking at the ones that didn't work. But even in the collection we've chosen, there's such a wide variety. And then when you compare that to all the movies that did work in the 80s, yes, it was blockbuster driven. Yes, it was studio driven. But it was still, to me, more exciting and still way more variety than what we see today, where it's all superheroes or Fast and the Furious. And that's more or less it,
Well, we were just talking off mic right before coming in to record, and we were talking about how long it's even taken us to look at the 80s stuff, right? And, like, we're 50 episodes in, plus at this point, and we haven't looked at anything of the 80s. And we were talking about how, even kids today or people growing up today are without cable. They're watching Netflix and Disney Plus, and look at the Netflix filmography. They sort things by decade sometimes, and there's like nothing from before 1975 or something. And even if they have something from the 70s, it's like maybe 3, right? And it's when I used to watch older movies, 80s and 70s films, or even 60s, I caught them on cable. I caught them on TBS Superstation. I caught them on, just randomly on Space the Imagination Station in Canada. And now, because you have to truly pick something to watch nowadays, it's just you don't really stumble upon any hidden gems anymore. And I think that's maybe even why, to answer your first question, is that why the 80s feel so new is because, nobody's watching anything from there. So when they do get a glimpse of nostalgia that they don't even recognize as nostalgia, they're like, oh, wow, this is like so much fun, a la Stranger Things.
Well, you just hit on something that is also very, very important. I'm glad you brought it up because I forgot to mention this, but I wanted to make sure I hit on it. Because this is another really key element when you talk about 80s and in particular cinema in the 80s. 2 things blew up huge in the 80s that was pretty much brand new to like movie fans. And that is cable TV, and in particular movie channels on cable TV like HBO and Cinemax. They might have started in the late 70s, but the 80s is really when it started to really take a hold. And also similarly, VHS and video stores. Yeah. That was brand new in the 80s. And the reason I say that's so important, and today's movie, Flash Gordon, is like a perfect example of this. So when you meet people of like my age, right, and like a little older, if there's a reason we feel so attached to these 80s films and they're like so ingrained in us and we are so nostalgic for them to a degree that you don't see in like subsequent generations, a big part of that is that when the cable channels started and when VHS first became a thing and video stores started booming all over the place, the selection available to you from both avenues was not huge. Obviously studios, once video started, for a while studios weren't even sure video was really going to take off. They weren't sure if it was going to be like a thing. So they weren't going back into their old catalog and like pulling out other old stuff from the 40s and 50s and putting it on video. They were just throwing maybe some of the newer stuff on video, and then other people were kind of coming in and making like these smaller movies to go straight to video, kind of early on, or lower budget things. Meanwhile, over on cable, you had stations like HBO and Cinemax, which are suddenly this brand new idea, movies 24/7. But like, what are they going to show? And again, I don't think studios were giving them their old classics. They were just giving them like the recent theatrical runs and maybe things from the last few years. So one thing that is definitely true, and I think my generation got this more than any other generation, and I think it's more true of the 80s than any other decade, is we grew up with like the same handful of movies on all the time. Yeah. And there are just certain movies that, and I'm sure because you've taught, you're friends with me, you're friends with some other people, some other friends who are around my age group, and you hear us talk about certain movies and we seem to know them by heart, right? They're just like, we know every line, we know every moment. And that's because, there are movies like Big Trouble in Little China, like The Last Dragon, like Karate Kid, like Flash Gordon, that I swear, when you were growing up in the 80s, that was on HBO or Showtime, like, every day, trust me. Like, right. It was pretty easy to see it if you wanted to all the time. One of my all-time favorite comedies, probably in my top 10 of movies, is Clue. And I think a big part of that is I saw Clue roughly 300 times as a kid. It was just always on, Yeah. Because these movie channels only had a certain batch of movies to show, and they just showed them over and over and over again. It took them a long time till they had a huge selection. And same thing with the video store. You went to the video store and you were kind of renting the newer movies and maybe renting them more than once. And so a lot of these like 80s films just had this level of repetition to them that we all grew up with. And there wasn't, video games were starting to be a thing, but they hadn't become they hadn't eclipsed movies yet in the same way. Right. TV was kind of it wasn't prestige TV yet. TV was like the lower echelon, right? So movies was like the big thing. And we were watching a lot of them on cable. We were watching a lot of them, renting them from VHS stores, and we were seeing a lot of these a lot. So it's not surprising to me that we haven't got to 80s films that often, because more often than not, most of these movies did pretty well in the 80s. The kind of movies we're talking about, right? A lot of them hit. So there's something very interesting about the ones that didn't hit, where you wonder, like, wow, how did, even in that decade where it was kind of, I don't want to say easy to be a hit, but what went wrong where you couldn't take off the same way, you know?
Well, it was also a different time that you didn't need to make $1 billion. You know, like, movies were still had relatively moderate budgets. You know, like, there were still comedies being made for $15-20 million, and nowadays that's an episode of a TV show.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, good. So obviously this is a conversation that will continue through this entire run of episodes. I just wanted to start with it. And obviously we'll keep coming back to this idea of, like, you know, what does each of these movies say about the 80s, and what, you know, do any of these inform stuff that follows and things like that. But I just wanted to start. But that's maybe one of the longest intros we've ever done. But Chris, as I said, kicking off pretty perfectly with a movie from 1980, why don't you tell us a little bit about Flash Gordon?
So it is directed by Mike Hodges. At this point, he's known for a couple of Michael Caine-led films, Get Carter and Pulp. He actually goes on to direct some of Queen music videos after this, because Queen is heavily involved in the score for Flash Gordon. It is written by Lorenzo Semple Jr., best known for this time, the campy 60s Batman series. He wrote and developed for the show, I believe. He wrote Papillon? Papillon? Papillon?
Papillon. Yeah.
Papillon? You're correcting me on my French?
Yeah, ironic, isn't it?
He also went on to make the King Kong from the 70s, and then he wrote Never Say Never Again, the unofficial Bond film. This was adapted by Michael Allen and based off characters created by Alex Raymond. This is based off a comic strip from the 1934, I believe.
Started in 34 and then just pretty much ran for decades.
Yes.
Very popular comic strip, and then also later on becomes a popular, like, series of, like, film serials, like back in the day. You know, like the kind of, when we say serials, hopefully people know what we're talking about. But like about 10 to 15 minute chapters that you go see when you go see a feature film in the theater. Before, there'd be a couple serials and they would end on cliffhangers, so you'd have to keep going to the theater every week to see the new installment. I just want to briefly, if you'll indulge me, Chris, I just want to read one little summary of the Flash Gordon comic strip and the character, so that we can kind of have that in our back pocket as we talk about this as a feature. And I know in a moment you'll talk about the budget, but let me just clarify here. So the idea of Flash Gordon is the comic strip by Alex Raymond follows the adventures of Flash Gordon, a handsome polo player and Yale University graduate, and his companions Dale Arden and Dr. Hans Zarkov. The story begins with Earth threatened by a collision with the planet Mongo. Dr. Zarkov invents a rocket ship to fly into space in an attempt to stop the disaster. Half mad, he kidnaps Flash and Dale. They land on a planet, halt the collision, where they come into conflict with Ming the Merciless, Mongo's evil ruler. So that is the general idea of Flash Gordon, and as I said, yes, definitely a character created to kind of compete with another popular sci-fi property, Buck Rogers, but one that a lot of people grew up with and loved throughout, like, the 30s, 40s, and beyond.
Somebody in particular who loved it was George Lucas, which we will definitely be talking about in a second. The budget of this film, though, is actually is conflicting budget. Anywhere between $27 and $35 million is what I found. Domestically, it made $27.1 million, and worldwide, it made about $69,000 more than that, which really just came from the 2020 re-release. So, about around $27 million total this movie ever made.
And probably part of the reason the budget, like, we can't get a definite number on it, is we can trace that back, at least partly, to another really important name. You just mentioned, you know, the director, the writer, Alex Raymond, the creator of Flash Gordon. But I think if we're going to talk about Flash Gordon, and we're going to talk about movies in the 80s, and these kind of big blockbuster movies, we also have to acknowledge the producer of this film, Dino De Laurentis, who is just one of the most interesting, captivating, bizarre movie mogul figures of the 80s. And he's definitely the person who, like, spearheaded this movie, and like a lot of Dino De Laurentis movies, it was chaos. And so this is probably not going to be the last time we talk about Dino De Laurentis, but I wanted to make sure we bring him up because obviously he's a big part of this. I'd say, I think of this, it's strange because, like, no offense to Mike Hodges, But when I think of certain movies, including this one, I think of them as Dino De Laurentis movies, even though he wasn't a director. But his stamp, you know a Dino De Laurentis movie when you see it, I think.
Well, at this point, he had done 2 comic book adaptations, made Danger Diabolic and Barbarella, both from 1968. And he was, like you said, he was the one that spearheaded getting this movie made. He wanted to get it made since the 1960s. And also George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, wanted to make this movie as well. And he optioned for the rights, and he couldn't get them. So what does Lucas do? He says, fuck you, I'm going to go make Star Wars.
Yeah. And this is the interesting thing about Flash Gordon, like, because I've read, and I'm not sure if you read this as well, Chris, but I read that Lucas went to De Laurentis, right? Because De Laurentis had the rights and basically said, hey, I love Flash Gordon. I would love this to be my follow-up to American Graffiti. And De Laurentis is like, no, as he often would, right? Like, just like, sometimes he wouldn't recognize, like, the talent that was in front of him, or I'm sure he just looked at American Graffiti and didn't see it, right? Yeah. So he's like, no, you're not the guy, because, interestingly enough, he had way more like highfalutin ideas for Flash Gordon. He was trying to develop it at the time to be directed by Federico Fellini. Now, Chris, I know you probably have never even heard that name before, but Federico Fellini is a very, very famous, very critically acclaimed director. Have you heard the name? You know,
I have heard Fellini for sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure. Yeah. I'm just giving you a rough time.
I'm a little bit of an idiot, but I do know Fellini.
It's kind of amazing to like even consider that idea of like a Federico Fellini Flash Gordon.
Totally.
But then you do think like Federico Fellini is someone who grew up like and like I'm not sure exactly when he was born. Let me see. I can probably find that pretty quickly. Yeah, he was born in 1920. So yeah, I would imagine he definitely grew up like reading this comic strip and probably watching the serials. And so like, why wouldn't he? I'm sure he was a fan of Flash Gordon. But he's obviously not a director you think of as a science fiction director. But that could have been cool. It could have been really cool to see what he would have done with it. But it doesn't matter because he ultimately said no. And then Dino De Laurentis decided to go to like another very, very well-regarded, very famous, kind of art, like film fanatic, film pretentious fan favorite, Nicholas Roeg, who is known for directing movies like Don't Look Now, The Man Who Fell to Earth. Later on, he would do The Witches, the one that like gave tons of kids like me kinder trauma when we were kids. But Nicholas Roeg, he was going to have, and Nicholas Roeg spent a long time developing a version of this. I guess I read that. Did you read the same story, Chris, where De Laurentis contacted him and said, hey, I want you to do Flash Gordon, and Nicholas Roeg went off for like a year and like wrote a version and then came back and De Laurentis said, yeah, that's not the version I want to make.
Yeah, a little bit of his version was going to be a comic book story, but for adults. Ming was a god, Flash and Dale were Adam and Eve, and Ming was an evil deity chasing them across the universe. It was definitely going to be more erotic. And I know Dino De Laurentis wanted it to be more humorous than a sex romp in
didn't want to make an erotic thriller of Flash Gordon.
No.
So then he turns to Lorenzo Semple Jr., as we said, who is really well known for co-creating and developing and writing a lot of the Adam West Batman show. And he had worked with him recently on his the remake of King Kong, which De Laurentis was also involved in, and Lorenzo Semple had helped him with that. So he asked him to start writing this new version. And what's like why he really wanted to get this going now, and to go back a second to what I was alluding to earlier, is that, and you already kind of spoke to this as well, but when Lucas was denied Flash Gordon, he just went off and did Star Wars. Star Wars was very much, we all know this now, but Star Wars was very much his homage, his tribute to Flash Gordon instead. Couldn't get the rights? Fine, I'll just make my own version of it. And that's why, Star Wars as I always knew it, now I know we have to call it A New Hope, but I am of the generation that grew up just thinking of it as Star Wars. But it was in episode 4, right? That was the whole idea. Like Lucas has said, well, I would go to the theater and I would see random episodes of the Flash Gordon serial. So I thought it'd be cool to make a movie where you just kind of join the story in progress and not explain everything.
Yeah.
And obviously that movie blew up so huge that now De Laurentis is like, we got to make a Flash Gordon. And it's just kind of funny that that's his reaction to, well, you could have had Flash Gordon from that guy. But also, Chris, that does mean multiverses are all the rage right now.
Yeah.
That means there is some universe somewhere where George Lucas made Flash Gordon instead of Star Wars. Now, here's the question I want to throw to you first. Does George Lucas Flash Gordon blow up in the same way? And are we like, today, are there like 18 Flash Gordon shows on Disney Plus? Is that like the Lucasfilm thing? Or did it have to be something new and something that was just kind of inspired by Flash Gordon?
I think it had to have Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, and Mark Hamill in that movie.
Yeah.
That's the magic of Star Wars. That I'm not trying to talk about my feelings towards Flash Gordon, which we will in a little bit here, but I think, I've always heard that Star Wars, it's just it's an homage / ripoff of Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and all that. And fair enough, I get it. There's like a trio of characters, and here we go. And then it's similar. There's an evil empire, and yeah, okay. But I think the magic of Star Wars is not just the wham bam style and technical special effects. It is the chemistry between those three leads, and it's something even to this day Disney, the owners of the goddamn property, are trying to recreate. And that for the life of them, they just can't. So to answer your question, only if those three were cast in Flash Gordon.
It sounds like it's still possible, because let me just throw it out.
Yes, it's possible.
Mark Hamill, Flash Gordon, right?
Yeah.
Carrie Fisher, Dale Arden, and Harrison Ford, Hans Zarkov. That's strange that he'd be playing that character.
Well, he does play a archaeologist. What is my trying to say? Professor. I'll just say professor. Well, I mean, he is playing a professor, so it's not too far off, I guess. I don't know. Or you know what? Give him Flash Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, he would be the better Flash Gordon, right?
But
yeah. So I mean, it could have happened. Like, that's the thing. Like, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, well, obviously we'll never know the answer to this, but knowing that, like, it is the cast, it is a lot of the chemistry, but it was a lot of like the magic of like what Lucas did with that at the time too.
Sure.
Right, so maybe if Flash Gordon had come out in '77 with that same crew behind it, maybe that's the one that would have blown up. But we'll never know. But what we certainly got in the wake of Star Wars was a lot of Hollywood trying to cash in on sci-fi suddenly, because that was the thing. Like, that was the big risk of Star Wars. That's why everyone called Lucas an idiot, because sci-fi was dead. You didn't do sci-fi as an A picture. Those were only like cheap B movies. Mm-hmm. You didn't really put any like real heft behind them. And then suddenly, in the wake of Star Wars, everybody wants their own Star Wars. And then you have Paramount going, you know what, maybe we should get Star Trek back as a movie franchise now. And then you have people like De Laurentis being like, well, we got to get this Flash Gordon going. So we just talked about the entire development. Fellini and Nicholas Roeg don't bite, but Lorenzo Semple Jr. comes in and helps. And then you said they end up settling on, and I hate to say that by settling on, but like, I actually Get Carter with Michael Caine is an awesome movie. So like, it's no offense to Mike Hodges, but I think of Mike Hodges, and I don't necessarily put him in the same echelon as like Fellini or Nicholas Roeg. That's fair to say, right? But they get him for this adaptation, and now we need to cast this, and two very interesting names come into the mix right away. Two names that to me are quite synonymous with the 80s to a certain degree. Do you want to talk about those two names, Chris?
Sure. Yeah, it's Kurt Russell was the number one choice for the role of Flash Gordon, but Russell was like, nah, because he didn't like the campy, no personality of Flash. That was in his kind of words. He wasn't into it, and obviously Kurt Russell goes on to incredible acclaim with Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York, and basically
Escape from New York is actually the movie he went and did instead of this, which good call. Right. Good call.
Yes, and it becomes a John Carpenter mainstay, and then an absolute cult classic / awesome A-lister. So he made the right decision. And another person who made, I guess he didn't really get a chance to say no, but Arnold Schwarzenegger was the second choice. But then they decided no because of his accent, which is kind of shitty to think about. It's like his Austrian accent was going to be too hard to understand, and but obviously Arnold, again, goes on to critical acclaim because James Cameron takes a flyer on him, and we run off with the Terminator. So he's fine. He's fine.
Yeah. I mean, we know that De Laurentis eventually gets over the thing about Schwarzenegger's accent, because De Laurentis does produce Conan the Barbarian, which is like one of Schwarzenegger's like star-making movies. And it's also just strange. It's strange and ironic that he's not willing to use Schwarzenegger because of accent for two reasons. First of all, the first, like, obviously one of the first movies Schwarzenegger like ever does in like America is Hercules Goes Bananas, or whatever the hell it's called. Right?
Hercules in New York.
Yeah, where he's just like fully dubbed, right? So it's like, I wonder why they didn't do that why they just didn't consider that here. But why that's even doubly ironic, and we'll get into this more when we talk about it. The leading man they do end up with ends up being kind of dubbed in the movie himself. So
yeah.
you could just use Schwarzenegger actually, but I want to save our thoughts on what we think about those two guys as potential Flashes instead of our leading man for when we talk about the movie.
Sure.
But why don't we talk about who they do choose? Kind of a step down. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say a little bit of a step down.
You mean the star of one episode of The Dating Game, Sam J. Jones, is a step down from Kurt Russell and Arnold Schwarzenegger?
I know. It's a crazy thing to say.
Wow.
Of course, iconic screen legend Sam Jones of Flash Gordon, and I think he's in like one of the Ted movies as himself, right?
Yeah. He was. Funnily enough, that's really my biggest. Other than being obviously a Star Wars fan and knowing kind of what Flash Gordon is that, I grew up with Family Guy, right? And Seth MacFarlane is like a gigantic Flash Gordon fan. So references to Flash Gordon have been popping up on Family Guy and American Dad and all his other shows, for 20 years. And then, in the Ted film, Sam Jones shows up as himself, and it's actually a pretty funny cameo. It actually works pretty good. He kind of goes, he's kind of like a drug addict and alcoholic at this point, and he just is only living in his Flash Gordon t-shirt and stuff, and it's actually kind of a funny scene. But yeah, that's really all that Sam Jones went on to after this movie.
Well, so. and you just mentioned, and this goes back to what I was just saying about how insane the 80s were, right? And this is the decade where this could happen, and where people like De Laurentis, who were just like willing to make these bizarre decisions when they have money to burn on these films, could just be watching an episode of a game show. The Dating Game is that's not a scripted show. That's a game show, and Sam Jones was like a contestant on it, and he just like looks at the screen and goes, "Hey, that guy's got like a good look. He's handsome. He's handsome. He's blonde. He's got that square jaw. Let's get him to be Flash Gordon." And for this guy to just get a call and be like, "Hey, you want to be a movie star? We're going to sign you not just for one movie, but 3 Flash Gordon movies." Yeah. We'll get back to that. Just the idea, like, I'm sure this is going to turn out fine, right? Did it turn out fine? We will talk about that. But I think there's one more. We'll talk about some of the rest of the cast as we talk about the film itself. I want to get to the movie.
Yeah, same.
But before we do, there is one more very, very important factor of this we haven't mentioned yet. Because to me, this is like maybe the most iconic element of the film, and that is the music. There initially, Dino De Laurentis is interested in having Pink Floyd do the score. They say no, they're not interested in it. So instead, they come around to Queen, and Queen ends up doing the score itself. There's a lot of it is done by Howard Blake, but Queen does some songs to the movie, including a very, very iconic theme song. And I think that has even held on to a certain degree more than the movie itself, or at least it's like such a big part of the movie's success and like what people remember about the movie.
I also think it's funny that they approached Queen and they showed them 20 minutes of the movie, and they then were like, "Oh my God, we love this, absolutely." Yeah. But Dino De Laurentis at the time had no idea who Queen was,
right? And
asked the question. I think he says something like, "Who is the Queen?"
Yeah, who is the Queen?
Yeah, who's the Queen?
Yeah, and even like Queen loved this to the point that the logo of the film is designed by Freddie Mercury.
Yeah.
He like designed the Flash Gordon logo for them because he got so into it. So that's just kind of cool, and I think obviously people probably know that theme song. Maybe even if they haven't seen the movie, they've probably come across that theme song, or at least it's one of those things. Maybe you don't even think you know it, but maybe you do know it.
Definitely. Well, I think that's the perfect time to just talk about the movie.
Clytus, I'm bored. What plaything can you offer me today?
An obscure body in the SK system, Your Majesty. The inhabitants refer to it as the planet Earth.
I like to play with things a while before annihilation. Pathetic Earthlings! Who can save you now? Flash! Object imaged in the Imperial Vortex. Flash! You save every one of us! Remove the Earthwoman. Prepare her for our pleasure. Flash!
Don't kill him yet, Father. I want him.
He's a
Go, Flash, go!
American football player Flash Gordon, along with his female companion, Dale Arden, are returning to New York City when their plane unexpectedly crashes into the lab of Russian scientist Dr. Hans Zarkov. Both Flash and Dale become unwilling passengers on board Zarkov's rocket ship, as Zarkov sets a course for the planet Mongo. Arriving on Mongo, Flash and his friends find the planet is under the dictatorship of the evil Emperor Ming the Merciless. Realizing that Earth and the human race is in mortal danger, Flash decides to unite the kingdoms of Mongo and combine the forces of rivals Prince Baron and Prince Vultan to rescue Dale, defeat Ming, and save Earth from annihilation.
Yeah, ultimately, that's why I wanted to read the description of the comic strip earlier. Not. This is a pretty good adaptation in general, just hitting like the broad strokes. You know, that sounds like they got it pretty much right. And yet we did not end up with this movie was ultimately not as successful and certainly not as, impactful on the larger culture as the comic strip seemed to be. So why? What happened? I guess that's for us to talk about. Chris, do you mind if I go first here?
Yeah. First, I gotta ask you. I do want you to go first, but also I can't remember for the life of me. Is this how many times have you seen this before, and how many times?
I mean, as I said, as a child of the '80s, of course, I've seen this before, and I couldn't even tell you how many times. Like, okay. But like many films of the '80s, the question, what is a good question, and one I probably can't answer, is I wonder how many times I've watched it from beginning to end. And how many times really I've just like, when I was a kid especially, would just turn it on and it'd be like halfway through and I'd watch a little bit of it, maybe to the end or something, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure I saw this in pieces so many times as a kid. And I haven't revisited a lot as an adult. But when I was watching it yesterday, revisiting it for the first time in decades, it was that thing where when something is that ingrained in you as a kid, certain moments in particular, when they came up, I was just like, oh my God, this is just so burned in. Like the whole sequence where they're putting their hands into the holes in the tree to see if that thing bites them. Mm-hmm. Like that just like came rushing back to me of like how I think that like freaked me out as a kid, found that actually like legitimately like terrifying. And like the whole, like the last 15 minutes, and we'll talk about if I think the last 15 minutes are actually exciting, but they definitely are like burned into my brain, and that theme song. So yes, I've seen it a lot, but not in a very long time. And the reason I haven't watched it in a long time is now so here's the dirty little secret, and this is where maybe I will lose a lot of my fellow 80s brethren. Even though I saw it a lot as a kid just because it was always on, I've never been a huge fan of this movie. And watching it yesterday, I probably appreciated it more now than I did as a kid for reasons that you might already guess based on what we were just talking about, and which I'll discuss more. But I still have the same kind of concerns about it. So this is a movie I watch, and I completely understand why this is a cult film and why some people are very, very into it. Like Alex Ross, the amazing comic book artist, painter, this is like one of his favorite films. This is one of Edgar Wright's favorite movies. I get it. I can look at this movie and say, if somebody told me this is their favorite movie, I totally understand. There are elements of this movie that I love and I think are so cool, especially today, comparing it to like what we get, from studios over and over. This movie to me has two barriers I have a hard time getting over. One is that the whole middle chunk of this gets really boring, I think. I think this movie starts with very high energy, has very, very fun for a while. And then I think the end is pretty memorable. But I think the middle gets to be like a little bit of a slog. And even yesterday watching it, I felt my attention drifting a little bit. And I do think the other problem with this movie, and the reason I can't love it as much as I wish I could, is Sam Jones. I do now that I know, because I never had read anything about this movie until the last couple of days. Now that I know there's a multiverse version of this movie where Kurt Russell plays Flash Gordon, my God, what a better movie that would be. Sam Jones looks the part, of course. He's a stunning human being on camera, but his performance does leave something to be desired. So I don't know. I'm kind of ultimately like in the middle of this, but I do think it's a very, very fun movie to discuss, and I'm really interested to hear what you think of it as someone coming to it for the first time. Because there's certain things I want to like heavily defend, and then there's other things I do want to kind of lovingly make fun of.
Yeah. So like I said, the only real knowledge I have of Flash Gordon is references on Family Guy. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I have never really seen true clips of even like scenes of this movie.
Yeah.
So Yeah, yesterday was my introduction to Flash Gordon as its own property and coming at it with adult eyes. So this is I was kind of fascinated by my own self, like how I was gonna feel about this, right? Because yes, this is such a cult classic. This has so much nostalgia. Children of the '80s go fucking crazy over Flash Gordon, and I think it is totally okay. It is pretty janky. Really, you know, it's a movie in the '80s, yes, but wow, is it giving you the '60s, you know, Lost in Space vibes, and actually is a show that I actually loved as a kid. I used to watch that early mornings before school. It played on Space, the Imagination Station, so I actually am in love with '60s sci-fi shows.
Are you getting paid by Space, the Imagination Station? Because that's the second time you've mentioned them.
I did. I mentioned them on the Spawn episode, I think, as well.
No, you already mentioned them in this episode.
No, well. Oh yeah, this episode too. I am getting paid for them. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's sort of entertaining. I think the look of it is cool. Like, it's bright, shiny. It's the retro futurism is cool.
Costumes are incredible.
Oh yeah, like we didn't even mention his name, but Danilo Donati is was in charge of all the design work, and the movie kind of gets away from the director because of him. From my research, he kind of took a lot of he just kind of like did whatever he wanted, and Mike Hodges would show up on set, and costumes and sets would be out of the realm of possibility for things that they wanted to shoot.
Yeah, and they were also like making the movie up as they went along.
Yes,
quite heavily.
Yeah. Isn't who is it? Is it Mike Hodges that says it was like one of the most expensive improvised movies of all time?
Yes, yeah, that is Mike Hodges. Yeah.
But yeah, no, the movie's okay. I praise the creativity. I love its abundance of color, and it's vibrant. The contrast is awesome. Again, it's just crazy creative.
Yeah.
But the worst thing about Flash Gordon is Flash Gordon.
Yep.
He sucks. I know you're kind of maybe, you know, dabbling around a little bit to seem a little nicer, but
we don't like to shit talk actors.
We don't like to shit on actors.
Yeah.
But he is bad. He's bad.
Yeah.
Sam Jones is kind of a goober. And you know, he's a big, good-looking guy, but he's a goober. He's kind of a big ape. You know, he's a dope. He's a wet blanket. He's pretty dumb, but not in that like charming way. You know, he's just
this movie needs a Harrison Ford. This movie needs a Kurt Russell. It needs someone with that glint in their eye. You know, that like lovable asshole. I mean, even like this movie, like I don't love Chris Pratt, but like this movie needs a Chris Pratt. You know what I mean? Like
yeah. This needs a Star-Lord. That's what it needs. And I just find, he's the worst part. And that's why I can't love this movie. And I can understand why people love it because they were children. But I don't know how anybody can become a new fan of this as an adult. Unless you were like indoctrinated through your childhood by your parents. You know what I mean?
Like I said, I think if you do, it would be entirely on the creativity on display, because as I watched it, you know, obviously, like you said, Sam Jones is the problem here, the largest problem. But yeah, I don't want to dismiss, because it is true. You know, we are in an age now, and we talk about this all the time on this show, where everything's filmed in domes, these like, you know, VR backgrounds. So to like watch these like legit sets and dozens to hundreds of extras in these awesome costumes. You know, some of the effects work. Sure, it looks like a little goofy today, but you know what effect I love in this? So first of all, we should say like this movie has a mixture of like everything I love, like, right? So it's we have miniatures, we got matte paintings, we got the practical effects, we got practical creatures, puppets, you know, like rubber monsters. Awesome. I love it all. An effect I love, and this isn't the only movie that does it, but this movie does it a lot, is where they create a sky, like a psychedelic sky, by taking like an aquarium and pouring different colored dyes into it, and then filming that and having that be the background. Oh, I always think that looks great, and that's like the sky on Mongo here, and I love it. So like this movie is constantly like a feast for the eyes, at least. So that's if you're enjoying it on that level, I get it. But yeah, I can't imagine anyone being too wrapped up in the story.
Well, and that's why somebody like Alex Ross makes sense. That why
course,
that he was drawn to this. Like Alex Ross is one of our greatest modern artists, you know, and of course he'd be drawn to that. And I love that shit too. Like it was like you say, a feast for the eyes. But every time these characters kind of talk or there's there's a total lack of exposition, and why do I give a shit about Flash Gordon, and who is this guy, and what is his relationship with Dale, and you know, in our discussions about modern blockbusters or modern franchise starters, sometimes we shit on that because there is too much expository dialogue, or there's too much info dumps, or there's too much like, let's explain this all now, but then we'll get to the action in the next movie. There's something to be said about this film that it just does throw you in, and it does complete the story, but it doesn't give me enough. It's still, for some reason, there's not enough meat on the bones. And I need more. I need more for my trio. I need more. I need to like them. I need to find them charming. And to be honest, I do like Melody Anderson as Dale Arden. I thought she was really good and she was kind of fun. And for what they give for Topol, Dr. Hans Zarkov, I think he's pretty good until
he's actually my favorite, I think,
Yeah.
because and I think the thing with him is, so Topol, who most people probably know is the lead of Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes.
He plays Hans Zarkov here, and I think the reason he's the most interesting character is because he gets to just be an asshole at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's the dick who, like, holds Flash and Dale at gunpoint and kidnaps them and forces them to go into space with him. And he's so antagonistic at the beginning that makes him more compelling.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole sequence in the middle where you, like, think he's been, like, brainwashed, but then he reveals that no, actually he found a way to, like, resist it.
By just resisting it.
He says, like, yeah, I thought of other things. But yeah, so he's like my favorite of the trio, actually, just because he's the one who actually feels like he has a characterization, whereas Dale and Flash have nothing. But you're right, like, at least Melody Anderson has some, like, kind of innate charisma to her, which Jones does not. Yeah. And
they have they have tons of glamour and soft lighting in the film, so like, she looks beautiful, obviously. And then what's her name, Ornella Muti, Princess Aura looks great, but she's awful.
She's awful, but definitely a childhood crush, that character.
Yes. She's beautiful. She's beautiful.
Yes.
And it doesn't, I mean, it also helps that she's perpetually horny the entire film. So
yes. Yeah. This is a very, very horny film, and we will probably talk about this. A lot of like plot elements and lines of dialogue that are kind of shocking today, because it's the stuff that just does not end up in PG or PG-13 studio fare. You know, this is very much a movie about Ming the Merciless trying to turn Dale into a concubine, and a lot of discussion about, let's just say, there's a lot of discussion about Ming fucking Dale in this movie.
Yeah, and a couple of the other girls try to...
It's rape. There's a lot of rape discussion in this.
Oh yeah, other girls try to roofie her.
Yeah, there's a whole sequence where they tell her, like, you know, take this drug because it'll make you, like, you know, just be more compliant. You know, no, you won't want to have sex with them, but you'll be, like, kind of more calm about it as it happens. So.
And then there's this like weird little cat fight thing on a bed with, like, barely any clothes.
Oh, you! No, I'm a prisoner too. You damn Mongol person! You couldn't tell the truth to save your life. Dale, stop! I'm going to be exiled in the morning! Liar! Ah! Oh, yeah. You liar!
So again, I understand why maybe boys from the 80s had this movie cemented in their heads. It's colorful and full of sex, but... it's just kind of, it's one of those all style, no substance movies. Maybe not even no substance, but you understand where that, like, I don't want to sound too bad or too mean.
No, I know what you mean, but I think why you might read it that way, because I think the other question here is there's a question of tone, and this movie has too inconsistent of a tone. And this is where I didn't know this until yesterday. I was surprised to find out this was written by Lorenzo Semple Jr., because once I knew that, I really found myself wishing this did have the tone of the 60s Batman show.
Yeah, totally.
which is awesome, right? That like that high camp, like very much making fun of itself, because like that's a show where when I was a kid, right, everyone made fun of it, and I know that was like kind of sometimes like the there's still, I think, people are like that's not Batman, but like thankfully in my lifetime, people have come around to being like, oh, that show is actually like brilliant. That show was making fun of itself, like that was a show that's intentionally campy. And I wish that's what Lorenzo Semple Jr. was doing with this film. But from everything I've read now about the making of it, it sounds like everybody was on kind of a different page about that. Like, some people thought they were making a campy comedy, but other people did not. And I think, like, Melody Anderson and Sam Jones were trying to make a real movie, right? They were trying to act, like, deadly serious. And I wish everyone leaned into the camp, because whenever this movie is, like, ironically funny, it's at its best, kind of. And there are some performers in this who I think come at it with the energy this movie deserves, and to me they're the obvious highlights. And I'm wondering if it's the same for you, and that is obviously Max von Sydow, failure to franchise all-star. I think this is like his 4th movie, playing Ming the Merciless, in a role I know he loved this role. He's the years afterwards always said like he really wanted this. He loved the comic strip growing up, and he like loved playing Ming, and I think it kind of shows. I think he like leans into it, this like really delicious kind of villainy, over the top villainy.
After the earthquakes and tidal waves, they won't be quite the human beings you remember. They'll be more tractable, easier for you to rule. In the name of Ming.
You mean slaves?
Let's say they'll be satisfied with less.
What about Dale?
Dale, we have decided to marry her. She's exceptional. We will breed with her and send our imperial progeny back to populate your Earth. You really prefer death to a kingdom? I'm disappointed. I'd much rather see you on my side than scattered into atoms. But as you wish.
And then the other two I love are our two princes. Brian Blessed as Prince Voltan, the main like bird man. I think he's very, very fun and a very over-the-top kind of big performance.
Gordon's alive!
And then, to me, probably the MVP of the movie, just doing like the kind of performance I want to see in this movie, is the great Timothy Dalton. Yeah. As Prince Baron, who is basically doing, as he would do later in The Rocketeer, another movie we'll get to eventually, he's just doing his Errol Flynn, right? Like his classic 40s movie star, musketeer, rogue kind of thing. And it's so perfect for this. And it's like any moment he's on screen with Jones, he's just like blowing him out of the water.
You came here of your own free will, Earthling. However, because of my word to order, I swear by the great god Arbor, I'll not kill you. Unless you beg me to.
Like, so well, those three, I think, have the right energy for this.
Well, Timothy Dalton is like playing it so straight, right? Yeah. And it's really working because of that.
Straight to the point of it being funny, though.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Lying bitch.
And then Brian Blessed has this infectious positivity. Yeah. Like he's just constantly smiling through all of his lines, and he's very boisterous, he's very big, and he's very loud about it. So that's why like they kind of work as like a two-hander,
What would you do if I were captive in your kingdom? I would remind you of Article 17 of Ming's law. No prince of Mongo taken captive shall be offered for ransom without first being given the right of trial by combat.
Is there such an article?
I'm afraid there is.
What a damn nuisance.
And yeah, I agree. Like, they're the best parts. But yeah, this movie it's all over the place. I have a couple things to say. One, the weird part you're talking about that you wished it was more campy. Now, I obviously went to go see, what do the masses think of this? Like what are people think? Why do people love this movie so much? And so many opinions that I saw were like, oh, it's incredibly campy, and it's taking the piss out of the genre, and all this. And I'm just like, I don't know. You guys, I think, are misreading this, or you haven't rewatched it, because I didn't get that sense at all. I got the sense that you're saying that it was all over the place, and everybody was on a different wavelength.
I think people remember certain scenes, and it's like that goes to the forefront of their mind, because there are a couple moments that I think are what the campiness we're looking for. Like, and obviously the main one that comes to mind right away, and I know this is something the actors improvised, is the football action scene.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They like changed Flash in this from a polo player to a football player. He said he's a New York Jets quarterback, and there's a scene where they're in Ming the Merciless's court. And all the people from the different kingdoms have to bring Ming gifts as tribute. And this one race brings him like these eggs. And Flash ends up taking the egg, using it as a football, and then like throwing the football at Ming's soldiers, doing shoulder tackles. And then they cut to Melody Henderson, Dale Arden, and she starts doing like cheerleading for him. And it's like a very, very quick, but it's so stupid that I did laugh. And it's like, if the whole movie had that energy, it'd be better. And I think so. Like people are like, oh, the movie's like a camp classic. It's like, well, no, there's like 4 scenes that do that, but the rest of it is trying to be pretty serious.
And there's a bunch of reasons why everything's all over the place. One, I just want to mention here like a quote from Lorenzo Semple Jr. here about the script. Dino wanted to make Flash Gordon humorous. At the time, I thought that was a possible way to go, but in hindsight, I realized it was a terrible mistake. We kept fiddling around with the script, trying to decide whether to be funny or realistic. That was a catastrophic thing to do, with so much money involved. I never thought the character of Flash in the script was particularly good, but there was no pressure to make it any better. Dino had a vision of a comic strip character created in a comic style. That was silly, because Flash Gordon was never intended to be funny. The entire film got way out of control. Mm-hmm. So there's that quote. But then on top of that, we gotta talk about the Italian crew. So, as a fellow Italian, my brethren, as they say, Dino De Laurentis is notoriously known for taking an English script and translating it to Italian because he wants to work with his Italian crews, and then they have interpreters on the set. Mm-hmm. This ended up being a total cluster because, again, actors would show up on set not knowing what the hell was going on, who was supposed to be where the gaffers were supposed to be sitting. You know what I mean? Like, it was just all over the place. And one of the biggest things was the interpreter. I think I have a quote here from Semple Jr., who told De Laurentis that the translations were off. Semple said, "I told him the translator was horrible. Her translations aren't any good. He said, I do not want to be fooled by the words. I do not want to be fooled by written words. I want to know the story." So it was a lot of just like feelings on the set.
Yeah. Well, and they said like Hodges has acknowledged that they weren't ever working with like a full like complete script. The translation elements on top of it, then the actors have said a lot of days they just show up and like, what are we doing today, right? And they just kind of to make it up. And that's a crazy thing to do when you have so much money already invested in the costumes and the sets. You have to figure out what your improvisations are based on what is available to you, and you have to like make sure it all matches, I guess, to like a general idea of the story. But yeah, if everyone had approached this. That's like if everyone approached it, say, hey, well, we're doing Star Wars, right? We're making like a serious sci-fi movie, or if everyone had been like, we're making a comedy, it could have worked. And I think the problem is that it's the mixture. The mixture doesn't work here, and the reason it doesn't work is because it's being. You could have movies that are kind of funny and kind of serious, but you can't have movies where half the people involved in the movie think they're making one, and half the people think they're making another. Yeah, that's the real problem. Yeah. But Chris, I am curious though, because we don't want to just be like we said. I don't think either of us are like entirely negative on it. So I am curious, like, what are some of like we've already hit on some of it, but if you want to like elaborate, or what are some of your like positives though? What are some of the elements you did enjoy in this? Like I already mentioned, I don't know if you maybe want to say more about the actors I mentioned, but like what else? Like what else did like work for you in Flash Gordon?
Of course the visuals are great, the costumes are great, the sets are awesome. Prince Baron, Prince Vultan, my favorites. I liked how we go to Endor or Dagobah for a while. And then we also go to Cloud City. That was fun. So we got a couple of Star Wars.
Another scene I definitely remember. It all came back to me. And maybe to me, like this might be my favorite scene. I don't know. It's one of the better things is when Prince Baron and Flash have to fight on that disc. Like that's such a cool idea. Like the way it's set up where Volton's like controlling the disc with a remote control. It like turns, they're trying to knock them both off it, and then the spikes are coming up and they're fighting with whips. Like, obviously, it's not the most intense fight because, it's one of those. It's an early 80s movie with 2 actors, not stuntmen. But I still just love the idea of it, and I think it looks pretty cool visually.
It does, and it genuinely looks dangerous. Apparently, that platform was 30 feet in the air when they filmed it. And, yeah, like Trev just said, there's spikes that come in and out.
And obviously not CGI because it's 1980. So.
Oh, they're definitely not CGI, and they're also not like synchronized together. So they pop up in like different spots all over the tilted platform, and they are sturdy and sharp. It shocks me that these guys didn't fall and hurt themselves, or like they had no sense of danger about maybe just like it hitting somebody in the eye. These spikes are real. Like they weren't.
Yeah, I was watching it now that we have the Blu-ray, obviously, or Blu-ray quality. I was like looking at it like a hawk, trying to see.
Same.
Where was there any moment where like one of them like steps on a spike and you see it clearly bend or whatever? And I never noticed that. Like they do a really good job of just always being standing at the right spot. But I was just thinking to myself, like, oh, those must be like foam or something, right? But there are a couple moments where they like grab one and you can see it's, oh no, that's pretty sturdy actually. So I'm guessing they must have been like hard plastic or something.
But that's why that scene is so good. And then it cuts back to Prince Vultan like having a blast, like fucking with them, right? So that really helps. And of course, I mean, I did think the music is pretty cool. Like it's got a retro synth rock feel. It's a little repetitive, of course, right? Like when it says music produced by Queen, and then they just kind of keep doing the same riff. The riff is awesome. Don't get me wrong, but there was a time there, especially during the fight on the platform, where there's no music at all, and I'm like, where's my score that I was promised by Queen? Yeah. So like the score's cool. But it's just repetitive. So no wonder people remember it because it was fucking bashed over their head for 90 minutes. So
yeah, but when it starts, like when it cranks in again at the end, it's hard not to like get into it, And it's a very corny song, obviously. But again, I think because it's corny, it like appeals more to the vibe I wish the whole movie was going for.
Yes. What about you? Are there other things you liked?
Yeah, again, like I mean, we talked about like already some of like the designs. Ming's like sidekick Clytus, whatever. I think he looks cool. Even continuing to like when he dies, and they have like that really gruesome like where his tongue and his eyes pop out of the mask.
Yeah,
I thought that was like cool looking. I think I want to say more about Ming actually, because to me like Ming is like one of the things I always remember from it, and I just. I know this, like I said, he's been in movies we've done before, so we've like waxed rhapsodic.
You whacked him off?
No. We've waxed rhapsodic before about how great Max von Sydow is, but again here, he's doing. It would have been very easy to go like super over the top with this part,
yes,
or be like almost too evil for it. Like right, he's really finding like the right balance, right, of like being scary but scary for a kids movie. And I think I just think you can tell he's having a ball. He looks awesome. To me, like he just sticks out as like, oh yeah, this is why Max von Sydow rules, because he's one of those actors who doesn't look down on being in a movie like this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's awesome, right? Because like an actor who is in The Seventh Seal could be like, what the hell am I doing in Flash Gordon? And he is not that person. He's like I think he treats Flash Gordon with the same level of seriousness that he treats The Seventh Seal. What they treats being in Strange Brew,
right?
Like that's why Max von Sydow kicks ass, and so I'm very happy to see him in this. Yes, the theme song is awesome. The obvious things that are good are the things we've kind of already hit on, right? It's never a boring movie to look at. It's a boring movie to try and
listen to.
To pay attention to, like throughout the middle, and then I mean, it goes
back to when you were a kid, right? Like this is the thing: when you're a kid, every movie was the best, right? And there's so many times you talk to somebody and they're talking about the movie that they grew up with, right? And they're like, "Oh my god, it was the best movie when I was a kid," and they can only remember 3 scenes. Right, they only ever want to talk about 3 scenes, and that is Flash Gordon. Flash Gordon is a movie that obviously people remember about 7 minutes of. And that's why it's their favorite movie. They like seeing the Hawkmen, attack the ship, with the Queen song playing, and then they love the football scene, and then they love, like you said, with the big tree trunk and putting your hand in there. It's scary, right? But then you have completely blocked out the other 80 minutes of complete bore. And that makes sense. That's your child brain, right? That's why we have memories. That's why we don't remember everything from our childhood. We remember just the moments. And I think Flash Gordon is special. To say something nice about it, even though I'm shitting on it while doing a backhanded compliment here, that's what's good about it, is that it does have those little moments that are, or that carve out a piece of your brain, a piece of your memory, and that is special. Not a lot of movies do that. Like, me and you have seen thousands of movies in our lives, truly. And not every movie is as iconic as Flash Gordon, even though I could probably rip it apart right now.
Yeah, it has just enough, like, cool moments or, like, weird moments. Like, I think of the moment where they're being taken down the hall, like, after they first get to, like, Ming's palace and they've been taken prisoner. And a random, like, lizard man runs out, right? And they, like, there's, like, voice comes on over, like, the PA and actually goes, "Halt, lizard man." And then, like, they call him Lizard Man. Like, what? And it's just some guy in, like, this cheap-ass lizard costume. And then, like, the security bot, like, vaporizes him. And it's just, like, so weird and random. Then there's, like, the little moment where they are trying to brainwash Zarkov. And they, like, go into his memories.
Yeah.
And you're seeing, like, his life. And there's, like, a really, like... I kind of love the moment because it's like, this is kind of more that, like, dark, campy humor that I was hoping for, where you find out that he, like, he lived through World War II. And so you see Hitler, and I think it's Clytus who goes like, well, now he showed promise. And I think, like, oh, that's pretty great, like, to have the bad guys be that evil. So there are just, like, these, like, brief flashes of, like, what the movie could have been. The whole, like, action climax, that's another thing, obviously, that I definitely remembered, right? So you say, like, well, you probably remember 3 scenes, and, like, yeah, that's the experience I had. Like, revisiting it yesterday, didn't remember much of the beginning, even though, like I said, I actually think the first 10 minutes are really fun, because you and I talk often about how we wish movies would just get to the point quicker, very often today. This movie does not waste any time, right? This movie uses, like, basic to the point of being funny exposition very well at the beginning, and it's just like, we need to get Flash and Dale onto this rocket ship, and they don't waste any time. And also, I just want to point out, very, very lucky that Ming the Merciless has never heard of Earth. He's never been here before, but when he first comes to it, we see the controls that he uses to create different weather events, and they're all labeled in English. I thought that was very, very lucky for him.
And one is actually earthquake.
Yeah. And tornado.
Yeah.
That made me, like, really kind of respect George Lucas more for, like, his choice to, like, never show writing in Star Wars. Be like, oh yeah, he was smart, because that's you're like, what? But anyway, so yeah, I love the first 10 minutes.
It's called Urabesh, Trev.
Or a basic. Well, what I really remembered, and the moments that, like, obviously latched onto my brain, were the thing with the test, the scorpion creature test of putting your hand into the tree trunk, the fight on the disc, and then the whole last, like, action climax. Now, I think the action climax is pretty awesome in concept, right? Flash on, like, a speed hover bike, leading these, like, bird men to attack Ming's palace. By the way, Chris, this is our 50th episode. We didn't mention that. And I think that's important to mention, because 50th episode, let's go back to our first episode, which also ended with the hero having to save his girlfriend from a galactic wedding. You ever think about that?
Oh, yeah.
This is John Carter and Flash Gordon both kind of have the same climax. But
it just shows you the 30s was creatively bankrupt.
Well, but I mean, yeah, John Carter also, like, a Paul Piro, just like Flash Gordon is, much of the same kind of source material there. Anyways, what I wanted to make, love the action climax and concept, except kind of sucks that Ming and Flash don't actually have, like, a confrontation. I did read in one of the scripts that they, there was a moment where they had a sword fight at the end, which I wish was there.
Right.
Kind of a bummer that Flash just crashes his ship into the building and it impales Ming, and that's it. But also, and I know you always got to give movies, like, a little bit of leniency when it's old special effects, but the final 10 minutes would be a lot more exciting if any time you saw Flash on his speed bike or the Birdmen, it looked like they were going faster than 1 mile per hour. I really wish somebody involved with special effects had just figured out, hey, if we just like speed up this like photography behind them a little bit, it'll actually look like they're moving. That might have been a good move.
Well, like when they scream dive and they just like gradually float.
Yeah.
You're like, okay. Or I know it's a problem with the time, but compositing is very difficult, and basically every single composited object is see-through. And I know that just purely because the Star Wars movies were like that until the special editions where they fixed it. That's okay in my mind. Just fix it, because it's when you see a bunch of birdmen coming down from the sky and they're all look like ghosts, just kind of loses the effect.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I did write down a couple lines I thought were funny, and again, this gets to me where I think there were moments where you get a sense of like, oh, this was written to be campy, right? There's no way they didn't realize. I wrote like there's a moment where Princess Aura, says to Dale, she's telling her about this like potion. She says, "My father always drinks a power potion before he makes love." It's like, what? It's like a daughter just talking about, like, yeah, let me tell you about how my dad drinks these protein shakes before he rapes his concubines.
My father always drinks a power potion before he makes love. Drop this into his glass tonight.
I can't, Aura. I gave your father my word of honor.
What word?
To try and be a good wife, if he'd spare Zarkov and Baron.
But also, I was also taken aback, and it just made me laugh because it was so silly. Throughout the middle of the film, Flash and Dale are separated for a long time. And let's not forget that Dale and Flash know each other for about, 2 hours before they're thrown into this adventure, if that, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of instantly fall in love. And then when they've been separated for a bit, they finally reunite, and Dale runs up and says, "I've got some stories to tell you." And Flash just instantly goes, "Save it for our kids." I was like, "Whoa, Flash! Is that why it's called Flash?" Moving fast here. So yeah, I like moments like that. There's like some funny highlights in this.
My favorite scene is actually my favorite jokey scene is when Flash is with Princess Aura in the rocket ship. She's like, he discovers that you can like use the machine to communicate telepathically with somebody. Yeah. And then Princess Aura shows him how to do it. So he's talking with Dale telepathically, but every time he finishes a sentence, he goes over, which I thought was kind of funny. And then as he's talking to her with his mind, Princess Aura's like kissing his neck and rubbing up on all over him, and then he accidentally thinks the words, "Oh, this girl's turning me on," and then Dale's like, "What did you say?" And he goes, never mind that thought."
Where are you?
In a rocket, racing to Arborea to get help. Are you okay? Over?
I'm locked in Ming's bedroom.
Fake him out.
How?
Girls know how, Dale. It's been done to me. Fake him out till I get back. Over.
It's too dangerous for you here. You can't come back. Stay where you're safe.
Oh my God, this girl's really turning me on.
I didn't quite get that. Think it again.
Forget I thought it. It wasn't about you. Over.
What?
And that is funny and it's good, but again, like imagine Caruso doing that.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know? Like yeah.
Different story.
For what it's worth, I'm not about to like make the claim that this is like the most incredible version this I've ever seen. However, I will say this might be, from my memory, one of the first movies I ever saw as a kid that has a somewhat believable like redemption arc for a villain too, with Princess Aura, to where she starts as like a villain and kind of is like more on the side of the heroes by the end, and I think it actually works well enough, right? Like,
sure.
And I think to me that was kind of new when I was a kid, like the fact, because I think definitely, and I said like I remember having a crush on her as a kid, and I think maybe part of that was like, yeah, see, she's not bad. She comes around. She learns that her dad sucks, you know. So more part of them for actually pulling that off, I guess. You know?
I agree. Yeah, it does a good job too, like even showing her when they kind of capture her, and Ming is like, yeah, you can torture my daughter too. And they start like whipping her and shit, and then he plays it like the deliciously evil, you know. He's actually watching from the corner, and he's got like grapes or something or like a drink, and he's just like, yes, more. Like it works really good. It works really good.
Yeah, that's like a really funny like reveal when they like she's being tortured. And she's like, my dad won't stand for this, and they kind of just like pan over and he's just like watching it like while drinking something. He's like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm fine with it. Yeah.
Now, I know we mentioned a couple lines that we like that Flash says, but Trev, did Sam Jones actually say those lines?
Well, that's the question, and I alluded to this earlier, right, where I said, like, what you might as well have just used Schwarzenegger, because we are not always hearing Sam Jones. In fact, from what I understand now, we're not always seeing Sam Jones.
Yes, so Sam Jones and Dino De Laurentis did not get along. Actually, by a lot of accounts, Sam Jones didn't get along with many people.
Right.
And he was kind of a nuisance on set. He started some fights. And then when they broke for Christmas after principal photography had wrapped, Sam Jones just didn't come back. Mm-hmm. So Dino De Laurentis and Mike Hodges had to film the post-production with a stand-in, and then get ADR from somebody. It was really not known, by the way, for like decades. Mm-hmm. And supposedly in 2020, a man named Peter Marinker has said that he was responsible for looping and ADRing most of his lines in the film. So it's still not technically totally known or credible, but it sounds like it's like this voiceover actor that did everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, like that's the risk you run when you just pick like a nobody to like lead your giant movie. Like this, you know, like a more successful version of it, but again, one that kind of backfired to a certain degree is George Lazenby. With On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Right.
He was just like some handsome model that they picked to be the new James Bond. Like the same thing happened. Like it's not that he was like super difficult while making the film. I think he was somewhat difficult because, you know, he's just not used to acting. Mm-hmm. And then also like you tell these people like, hey, we're picking you to be a movie star just because of your looks. Like they just get this big head right away, right? And this like, ego, yeah. And so it just sounds like the same thing happened with Sam Jones. And you said it's that was funny to read the stories about how they said he was just kind of constantly getting in fights. Sounded like both on set and off set.
Yeah.
And like one day he came to set and he'd been in a fight the night before and he had like this huge cut on his face and they're like, oh God, now we got to try and like cover this up with makeup and make sure it's like consistent throughout the movie. So it's just funny to think like what a headache to put up with for like this performance, you know?
Yeah.
I'm reading this book right now. This is like a tangent, but it is on topic. I'm reading a book called Hollywood Hellraisers, which is a history of Marlon Brando, Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, and Warren Beatty. And clearly it's a whole book about how these guys were just all gigantic assholes, right?
Right.
Misogynists, drug addicts, crazy, like Marlon Brando's crazy, like method acting nonsense. And I'm just reading the book and it really makes you hate them, right? Like, yeah, obviously I respect their talents. I'm a fan of all four of those guys on screen. But you're reading it and you're just like the way Marlon Brando would like hold up productions and like the way he would treat his directors. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, oh, like nobody's like, nothing is worth that, right? Nobody should have to put up with it. But then there's always that part of you that goes like, but the work, I guess at the end, you know, you get why people put up with it, right? Like, I don't think they should have, but I get it. And then you think of like putting up with Sam Jones and then like looking at the dailies and go like, well, no, we can't replace him. Like, look at what he's giving us. Like, no, that's not the case. Right. Like, it's just, if I was like Dino De Laurentis and I was already this like crazy producer that just tosses money around, I think I might've been tempted to just like fire him after 2 weeks and start over with a new actor.
Well, and that's what's so kind of frustrating about the movie is that like they should have known by the weekend, you know, that he was terrible. And also, like you said before, that they had planned for a second and third film. The second movie was actually supposed to take place on Mars. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it fell apart because the movie, you know, didn't do well financially, but also because Sam Jones just kind of refused to come back. So I was like thinking, like, just make the fucking movie and, you know, get your budget in order and hire somebody else. I don't really understand why they didn't go forward with a second one.
It didn't make money. I mean, that's why.
I guess that's the biggest. Yeah, I guess so.
It is funny that, like, you know, as you said, like Sam Jones, like, did not come back after the Christmas break. You know, was looped in the film ultimately. He didn't get along with anybody, and then he ended up suing Dino De Laurentis for not making Flash Gordon 2 and 3.
Right.
It's like, what kind of dumbass ego do you have where you think like, why do you think they want to make 2 more movies with you after that falling out, you know, and the performance of the film? But
He's a story that I just can't feel bad for. You know, like it sucks to, well, it doesn't suck. You know, we don't like to make fun of actors, but
no, we don't.
He made his bed. You know, and I heard there I guess there's a documentary that's like Life After Flash or something. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but I've never seen it.
I haven't. I just recently learned about it, actually. Yeah.
And I guess Sam Jones went off to starring in a few little tiny roles in like D-list type films here and there, but then ultimately just runs the con circuit and is a security guard, like a private security guard. So like, fair enough, all the power to him, but like, dude, I mean, don't bite the hand that feeds, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's like, if this movie was like equally as, you know, meh as it was, but it was like the first movie of somebody who went on to be like a huge star, right? Like, let's say this was Kurt Russell, and let's say it still wasn't that great, but there would still be something about like, well, but it's kind of cool to watch this like early Kurt Russell movie. But I think it's hard for me also, again, to like be as into it as even a cult film as other people are, because I'm not like, oh, I can't wait to watch Sam Jones again. You know? And there's like nothing about like his, like you said, there's nothing about his story afterwards. Like, I don't even feel like watching that documentary, because it just, he's not an interesting person to me, I guess. Like, to be given, I get it, right? I can never say I don't know what I would do if that happened to me, right? If I was put in that situation. But to be handed that opportunity, to be a nobody, and to be given, hey, we're going to make this gigantic sci-fi movie. We want to make the new Star Wars, and we're picking you. And then to just show up on set and get in fights and be an asshole, like, oh well, you know. I'm not sad that this guy didn't have like a career afterwards, I guess. I mean, I hope sounds like, if, you know, he's willing to make fun of himself now in like the Ted movie and everything. Like, hopefully he's outgrown that, right? And he's learned some lessons from it. But
well, that's why I guess I come down on this film. Like, usually we ask each other like, what would you want from the sequels, or like, would you want any more? And I guess I'm a little surprised by just how medium this movie is. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'm just surprised after all these years of knowing about Flash Gordon, about knowing that it was the inception point. I guess the property was the inception point for Star Wars, right? Weirdly, Star Wars was the inception point for Flash Gordon the movie.
Yeah, that's what's most interesting about the movie, actually.
But I just find I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed with like the cult status of this. I don't really see it. I don't know. I don't know why anybody would watch this multiple times, especially as an adult. Unless you had that childhood nostalgia boner for it. And I go back to what I said earlier was, I don't think that this is gonna have new fans. And again, you know, your friend group or people you know from your time frame, not that you're super old, that's not obviously not, but from the 80s, like people that you know that are growing up in the 80s or even the 70s or whatnot, like, are they going to be mad at us listening to this? Are they going to be disappointed? Are they going to be do they think we're wrong? Like, I don't know about your relationship even with fellow fans of this movie, because I don't have any friends that are fans of this movie.
It's strange because this also, like, it's hard because, like, obviously I feel like we're going to say this and then suddenly we're going to get like all these like people saying, no, like, I love Flash Gordon, right?
Yeah, totally.
You never know. But it's one of those movies that everyone accepts as a cult film. Like, everyone has heard of Flash Gordon. Everyone knows Flash Gordon. But then I don't really think it's not a cult film, to use some titles we already threw out before. I don't feel like this is as beloved as Big Trouble in Little China, you know? No. Like, it doesn't have that same kind of like cult following as some other like 80s properties that didn't really work. And I think the proof of that is, as I said, like, it's a title everyone knows. It's a title everyone can kind of reference. People know the theme song, but has there been any like great drive to like make to like reboot Flash Gordon? No, not really. Like, there's been a couple. There's been like some Flash Gordon cartoons and a live action TV show that was on the Sci-Fi Channel in like the early 2000s, but there's been like no big push to make the next big, it's not like Disney is buying up Flash Gordon to suddenly like reboot it or relaunch it. This is like one of those movies that people who are into it, I guess, are really into it. But I think Hollywood understands not enough people are into it for this to be, even in the recent wave of like 80s nostalgia madness, nobody was like, let's make the Flash Gordon Legacy sequel. Let's call up Sam Jones and do Son of Flash Gordon, or even just like let's remake Flash Gordon. I haven't heard that in any significant way. So I think Hollywood realizes that this actually has a small cult following. I think.
Yeah, like there. Don't get us wrong. There has been talk of rebooting it. Like since 2014, there was talk. 20th Century Fox.
Robert Rodriguez was like involved at one point or something, right? Like
Matthew Vaughn was in talks to direct.
Okay, yeah.
And then in 2018, the Overlord director, Overlord, by the way, a movie that me and Trev both we like a lot. Julius Avery was reportedly recruited to direct. And then there was an animated film under Disney and Fox by Taika Waititi for a while. And then back in actually July of 2021, the idea is that Taika Waititi would make a live action version of this movie, and I call shenanigans. That will not happen. That will not happen.
Yeah, like I pretty much like any time one of those projects has come up, I think my mentality would be like, that's not going to happen.
Totally.
Right? I just it's one of those. There are certain properties like this. I think Buck Rogers, which I mentioned earlier, is another one. Red Sonja is, to me, a huge example.
Totally, yes.
These projects that, like, because they exist, somebody in Hollywood always feels like they need to have it, like, as a potential franchise to get going, right? And the ball always needs to be up in the air. But no one really cares enough to finally pull the trigger on it. Flash Gordon and Red Sonja are like the two biggest examples of that to me, where it's like there's always somebody who's like allegedly working on it. Like Jesus Christ, like RoboCop is that now, where it's like, no, we promise we're making another RoboCop. It's like, no, you're not. Like, just you stop, and I think Flash Gordon is just one of those. I'd be shocked if a Taika Waititi live action Flash Gordon happens in the next few years.
Yeah. Would you watch it?
Yeah. I mean, well, I feel like we'd probably have to, because it would probably be another failure that we'd have to talk about.
Isn't it funny? There's so many movies now that like they're either coming out on Netflix or actually to theaters that I sit back and I'm like, fuck, I might have to watch that one day, so I'm not gonna watch it now.
Well, so because you asked if I would watch that, and then just a moment you mentioned, and something we always try to talk about with all of the movies we cover is like, what would we have wanted to see from a sequel, or would we want to see a sequel? And I think, would I have been down for a Flash Gordon 2 for this? Obviously, as a kid, I certainly would have been, right? And even if I did, I think as a kid you don't want anything. You just take what's given to you. And it's probably more that if Flash Gordon 2 had happened, I'm sure I would have ended up watching it all the time again, like I watched this one.
I mean, the moment they say that they recast Sam Jones, I would watch it.
That's exactly the point I was just about to make. I was just going to say, I think the key to a sequel would have just been actually just get a new leading man. Like they were like more willing to do that back in the day, Like now there's always like this like freak out if you talk about like recasting someone. But I mean, like the most like high profile example in like recent years I can think of where they came close was, remember when like Jake Gyllenhaal almost took over Spider-Man away with Spider-Man 2? Yeah. But like, yeah, just do it. With Flash Gordon 2, they should have just like got rid of Sam Jones, got an actual decent actor, brought the rest of the cast back, because I would like to see more of like Timothy Dalton and Brian Blessed and Topol in these roles, and Saito, but yeah.
And in relationship to, let's talk a little bit about the modern way of teasing up a sequel versus this one. This one does tease a sequel.
Yeah, that's the other thing that was important too, and I wanted to mention actually, because I think, again, I can never know for sure, but I have to imagine this was the first movie I ever saw as a kid that did that. Like that idea of being like, wait, what? Like, oh, they're like telling me there's going to be more.
Well, in the weird one, it reminded me of The Matrix Reloaded, because like at the end of that movie, it goes, to be continued, to go into Revolutions, but then at the end of Flash Gordon, it goes on the title goes the end, and then a little question mark comes up.
Yeah, and they show like Ming's ring is laying on the ground, and somebody picks it up, and you hear like laughter.
Yeah, and there's apparently there's reports that Mike Hodges always planned that to be Clytus that reaches for it. And Clytus is the guy, like you said, that you see melt. So,
yeah.
Again, who the fuck knows when you're in the sci-fi fantasy world right now? And as we're seeing even today, nobody's ever really gone.
No one's ever really gone.
Yeah. No, you would have, like, the villain could have been like, you would reveal Flash Gordon has an evil twin named Smash Gordon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, just recast
Crash
Sam Jones,
Gordon.
Crash Gordon, and Emperor Ting. Yeah. Is Emperor Ming supposed to be like kind of Fu Manchu-y? Is this a thing, or am I just reading into the makeup right now when I watched it?
I'm.
Is it doing Yellowface?
You're probably not wrong. I'm guessing that casting Max von Sydow was probably a wise move to like not acknowledge that and not have him. He's certainly not playing it Fu Manchu-y.
He's not. That's why I ask. Yeah.
But Ming the Merciless and the way it's drawn in the original comic strip, I'm guessing was, if I had to take a guess, I would probably say we know where Alex Raymond was coming from. Not to besmirch Alex Raymond, I am, but yeah.
Yeah, respectfully, he was a racist. No, I'm just joking. We'd only make fun of comic creators, okay? But yeah, like that's really all I gotta say about the movie. I wish I was more in love with it. I really do. I think I don't know if I was pimping it up for myself, but I was like, finally, I'm gonna watch Flash Gordon, this ultimate cult classic of science fiction from the 80s. And I walked out of it being like, all right, I'll never watch that again.
Yeah, I agree. I'll probably never watch it again, and that is sad. But I also think it's a strange thing where, even in its failings and the fact that neither of us are walking away super impressed with it, I do think it was still like the perfect movie to start this series with, because it still is very 80s, and that's like everything that's like working in it, but also everything that's not working to me is indicative of a lot of what we're going to talk about with this decade.
Definitely.
Because honestly, like a lot of things we just said that aren't going right are very representative of that just notion in the 80s of like, we have to make the next Star Wars quickly. Let's just start throwing money around. Let's take this property. Oh, get this guy that was on a game show. He's handsome. Right?
Yeah.
Like, these are the things that suck, but also they're so indicative of this decade. So this movie just does scream 80s. This just isn't one of the better examples, quality-wise, of an 80s film.
Well, hopefully next episode in Fallback to the 80s will brighten our spirits. Maybe it will live up to whatever we think of it in our minds. But it is the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai across the 8th dimension. Mm-hmm. I don't even have a single frame of reference for this. I don't know nothing. I don't even know what the poster looks like. Nothing at all.
You don't know who like stars in it or anything? Or...
Nada.
Okay. Well, I'll say I'm not going to spoil it. I mean, I don't know why I wouldn't, because obviously you're going to probably look it up before you watch it.
You're like, Kurt Russell's in it. It's like, okay.
Do you want me to tell you? There's one actor in it that you're going to be very, very excited about. Do you want me to tell you who it is right here on the air? Do you want to get your live reaction?
Yeah, you know what? Tell me on the air, because I'll do a little bit of research before watching the movie. So,
well, not the leading man. The leading man of Buckaroo Banzai. Buckaroo Banzai himself is Peter Weller, RoboCop himself.
Oh, cool. Okay, awesome.
But here's where I think I'm going to pique your interest, Chris. One of his his team, one of his sidekicks, in the movie. A favorite of you and I, Sir Jeff Goldblum, is in.
Really?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Cool. Okay. All right. Yeah. That's great. I love those two actors. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Mm-hmm. Nice. All right. Already better than Flash Gordon.
Yeah. It's Buckaroo Banzai. Buckaroo Banzai, I'll just say, is an even weirder film than Flash Gordon. So
okay.
That's and I'll leave it at that.
Cool. Cool. Well, follow along with us at F2F Pod. That's at F2, the number 2F Pod on all the socials. Like us there, like us everywhere. Rate, review, whatever you do. Star rating would be great. And just join the tribe, hit that subscribe, and keep on with us along Fall back to the 80s. Mm-hmm.